Yes, good evening. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Brown. Welcome to COVID in Black. I am Dr. Randall Morgan, and I presently serve as the Chief Executive Officer of the W. Montague Cobb NMA Health Institute. I also had the honor of serving as the 95th President of the National Medical Association. The program this evening is a major collaborative effort spearheaded by CoVPN, the National Medical Association, and the Cobb Institute, and joined by the National Black Nurses of America, BlackDoctors.org, the Historically Black Schools of Medicine, Howard, Meharry, Morehouse, and Drew, and also BIO. The purpose of this webinar is to take the opportunity to speak to as many health providers of color, including physicians, nurses, therapists, psychologists, pharmacists, and others who provide capable and compassionate care to individuals under treatment who look like them and share cultural experiences. Medical providers are among the most trusted voices Black communities turn to for expert advice. And in this episode of COVID in Black, the panelists will engage Black healthcare providers in open and transparent conversations to build their confidence and comfort in the vaccine process. This episode will provide a forum for honest and frank discussions and offer opportunities for Black healthcare providers to have their questions answered by leading Black experts. The panelists will unpack the importance of raising awareness and knowledge about COVID-19 clinical trials, factors to consider when referring their patient population to COVID-19 clinical trials, and what they believe is needed to support acceptability and uptake of an approved COVID-19 vaccine within Black communities. Before we begin our program with the panel, I would like to introduce Dr. Leon McDougall, the current and 120th President of the National Medical Association, for his remarks. Dr. McDougall.
Thank you, Dr. Morgan. And time flies when you're having fun. So this is an important forum this evening to speak to our peers. We've had a number of these forums speaking to the community, having the leading Black doctors be on the front line in regards to addressing concerns and asking questions and being a part of the process. And as you know, the National Medical Association has convened a COVID-19 task force on vaccines and therapeutics following a resolution by our House of Delegates. So I commend the Cobb Institute and BlackDoctor.org and Dr. Reed Tuckson and our consortium of 4 Black medical schools and other partners in convening this important conversation this evening, and look so forward to participating.
Expert will be shared this evening by 5 outstanding experts of color who will share during the opening remarks as well as a panel discussion. It is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for the panel this evening, Dr. Doris Brown, the 118th President of the National Medical Association. Dr. Brown is a co-PI for the Cobb Institute All of Us campaign research program. She is also the president of Brown and Associates and a retired colonel of the United States Army. Dr. Brown, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yes. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this program. I think we're getting we intend to have a robust discussion this evening about COVID and your role in alleviating the uncertainty for our patients and our constituents. This should be a very interactive program with a robust discussion. So we want you to feel free to put your questions in the chat box, And throughout the discussion, we will try to get as many questions answered as possible. Just to give you a little bit of feedback, we are also streaming this presentation live on Facebook, and it was also being carried in the social media outlets of all of our participating organizations. Additionally, it is being recorded and will be housed on the BlackDoctors.org website. So, exhaustion, impatience, and burnout are creating new risks for the coronavirus cases that are beginning to soar throughout the world. There are nearly 56 million people that have been infected globally. In the United States, we have surpassed 11 million cases and nearly 250,000 deaths. More than 150,000 new cases are occurring daily in the United States. Our healthcare providers are lost on the front line. Hundreds of US healthcare workers have died fighting COVID. And just want you to look at the number that's coming from the Kaiser Health Newswork and Guardian News that is showing that we have reached 1,396 deaths. Did those individuals have to die? And if you look at those numbers, you will see that nurses are leading the pack, followed by doctors and other healthcare professionals. And of course, we all know that when we look at the race and ethnicity of those deaths, Blacks represent 70% of those deaths. So tonight, this is a unique learning and communication opportunity for all of us who are providers of professional healthcare services to our patients and the community. We are the trusted voices in the community, and we hope that this program will provide you with the acknowledged benefit and from the experts in the field of vaccines who are really trusted agents. This event is crucial because we know we are in the middle of this pandemic, and it's threatening our communities now and probably into the foreseeable near future. Certainly, it's going to impact all of us in terms of our Thanksgiving holiday and moving on to the other parts of the holiday for the rest of this year. So tonight, we aim to provide an opportunity to translate and communicate information in a clear and objective manner in order that you can provide the necessary and appropriate care and counsel for your patients. So let me move on to this stellar panel that we have that is a very dynamic panel. And I'm just going to give you a very brief introduction overview for them. I think their bios are on our website because we want this to be a discussion. The first panelist is Dr. Kizzmekia Corbett. She is the Senior Research Fellow and Scientific Lead in the Vaccine Research at NIH. She will be followed by Dr. James Hildreth, who is President and Executive Officer at the Mcmurray Medical College. Following him will be Dr. Stefan Wallace. He is the Director of External Relations at COVID-19 Prevention Network. And Dr. Reed Tuckson will follow him as the Managing Director of Tuckson Health Connections. And we will end our discussion with Dr. Melissa Mcmurray Heath, who is the President and CEO of Biotechnology Innovation Organization, better known as BIO. We hope that you will put your questions in the chat box and we will have this robust discussion. So again, Dr. Corbett, you're the lead.
Hi, and thank you so much for the introduction, Dr. Brown. So I am Kizzmekia Corbett. I am the scientific lead for vaccine research at the NIH in the Vaccine Research Center. I was largely involved in developing the vaccine for coronavirus, particularly the one that's being developed by Moderna. And I'm happy to field questions about the development process, the work that we've done for several years leading up into this moment, the intricate details about the collaboration between the National Institutes of Health and Moderna, and any questions that you have about how the vaccine is made, how it was tested preclinically, and also in phase 1 trials to inform how it moved very rapidly through the clinical trial trajectory and to what is soon to be probably EUA and then licensure. And I'm very happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Hildreth. You're muted.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Dr. Brown. I'm really happy to be a part of this important conversation. I'm President and CEO of Mcmurray Medical College. Our organization has been taking a lead here in Nashville for COVID-19 testing, making sure that minority communities have access to it. We're partnering with churches and local organizations. My own personal background is I'm an immunologist and virologist. I've been studying viruses since 1978. I've been deeply involved in the fight against HIV. I'm on the FDA committee that will review the vaccines for approval. And we are actually, in fact, going to be testing one of the vaccines for COVID-19 here at Mcmurray. And so I can answer questions about the approval process, how the vaccines actually work. And I really want to talk about why it's so important that we, people of color, are part of the studies that are ongoing right now. Thank you. Very happy to be with you tonight.
Thank you. Dr. Wallace.
Hello, hello. Thank you all. I am excited about this panel and this conversation. Director of External Relations for the COVID-19 Prevention Network and the HIV Vaccine Trials Network. So I'm looking forward to talking a bit about the clinical trials sort of phases, the specifics and considerations regarding the Belmont Report and informed consent, how patient and participant safety is considered while participating in clinical trials, as well as the importance of diversity in our clinical trials. And then finally, how we've leveraged our HIV experience through the Division of AIDS funded clinical trials networks to support a COVID-19 response. Thank you.
Yes. Dr. Tuckson.
I'm happy to be here as well, and to follow up on something that Dr. McDougall mentioned. We have been able to create an unprecedented relationship between the organized leadership of Black health and the Black community. We have brought together all 4 of the historically Black medical schools, the National Medical Association, the Cobb Institute, the National Black Nurses Association, along with the National Urban League and BlackDoctor.org, having conversations with America. We've had 2 major town halls to date that have given us extraordinary access and insight to how African-American people in our communities are thinking about this vaccine. We reached 250,000 people already. We have a 3rd one coming up in a couple of weeks, and we will have a major conversation on Friday with all of the leadership of the Black media. Radio, television, magazine, print, and so forth. And so I'm happy to be able to sort of give some of the perspectives of what we're seeing as we talk to Black America, and also have a particular interest in the dissemination process and some information also if you're curious about the reimbursement practices as well. Glad to be with you.
Thank you. Dr. Mcmurray Heath.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Brown. My name is Michelle Mcmurray Heath. I'm president and CEO of the Biotechnology Innovation Organization. We are the world's leading advocacy organization. We're representing over 1,000 biotechnology companies, 95% of whom are small companies. My background is I'm an MD PhD. My PhD is in molecular immunology. My medical training is in pediatrics. And I've worked on Capitol Hill. I've been Associate Center Director for Science in the Center for Devices at FDA, and worked at Johnson & Johnson as a leader for regulatory and clinical. So I can speak to our company's united effort to try to produce new vaccines, antivirals, and therapeutics for COVID, as well as some of the pathways that they've had to face navigating the FDA and trying to work with communities to make sure we have good representation in the clinical trials.
Thank you so much. Now let's get to this discussion. I see we have questions coming in already. I would like to ask Dr. Corbett the first question because it comes in about vaccine development. How are they developed? How do they work? And one question that we have, please explain in layman's term, they're saying, how is it that phase 2 and phase 3 occurs simultaneously? And I think it may be important to talk about the phases of development. Thank you.
Absolutely. So there are the phases of vaccine development, or really any drug development. Well, they really start in the preclinical phase, which is not a clinical phase, but it is when the vaccine is tested in animals, and there gets to be a really broad understanding about how it might be able to be translated into a human. So this happened in mice and in monkeys for the COVID-19 vaccines. And then the phase 1 clinical trials is a very small clinical trial, usually around 50 people, where information on safety is largely assessed. But there are some secondary endpoints on how the vaccine elicits immune responses. And then from there, a phase 2 clinical trial happens where about 500 people are enrolled, and you get more nitty-gritty about the doses of the vaccine and more information about the safety and immune responses. And then finally is the phase 3 clinical trials, where upwards of 50, 60,000 people, but for many of the vaccines that are being developed, at least in the US, it's around 30 or 40,000 people that are enrolled in these phase 3 clinical trials. And the real question in those trials is, does the vaccine work? Does the vaccine work at preventing disease? In this particular case, COVID-19 disease. And so the way that this so-called warp speed, as it's called in the media, but rapid development of these vaccines is working, is that these phases have been compressed to a point that at each phase, there's a checkpoint that allows for the next phase to start. So simultaneously, all of the trials can be working at the same time. So the checkpoints in the preclinical phase was really, are you eliciting an immune response? Can you see that the vaccine is working in animals? And then from there, from the phase 1s, the checkpoint is the vaccine safe, at least acutely so? And then from there, the phase 2, the checkpoint is it safe in a large amount of people? And then a phase 3 can start as all of these data are coming in to really inform how the phase 3 may start. And so these things are happening simultaneously, but with really strategic checkpoints that the FDA has laid out. And generally speaking, this sometimes these phases actually take years. For example, the phase 1 actually started, for example, in March, and it is a year-long trial. So people are still being monitored from the phase 1 along the way as even the phase 3 is continuing. So a lot of people say you don't necessarily have long-term data, but we do at least have through month 7 at this point from 45 people that were vaccinated back in March with some of the experimental in the experimental trials. And so it's a simultaneous effort, but at each point there are checkpoints that are regulated by the FDA, and data is looked at closely from various different angles, and experts really understand how the vaccine data might inform the next phase of the clinical trial.
Thank you so much.
Dr. Brown.
Yes. I can't see.
Oh, it's Dr. Hildreth.
Oh, yes, good.
Can I just add a couple of points?
Please. I was going to ask you the next question, but go right ahead.
One of the things that needs to be pointed out about the speed of this is that there was a pre-existing infrastructure for HIV vaccines, and it was called the HIV Vaccine Trials Network. That network was asked to pivot to COVID-19 vaccine work. So this pre-existing infrastructure did a great deal to accelerate the process. Let me also point out that one of the things we have going for us, the technology being applied to the COVID-19 vaccine is really rather amazing. And people should keep in mind that the genome of the virus was published in January. And here we are in November, literally about to give EUA approvals to 2 vaccines. And the extraordinary speed is really related to 2 things, the technology and the pre-existing infrastructure that was asked to pivot to COVID-19. So it may seem like it's amazing, it is amazing, but those are the 2 reasons I think why we've achieved this in such a short period of time.
Thank you. Well, the question that was sort of related to that is the vaccine development process for COVID-19 the same as for other vaccines that we've developed? And so again, you were addressing some of that. Let me ask both Dr. Hildreth and Dr. Mcmurray Heath, when you talk about the different platforms and whether it's a monoclonal antibody or a vaccine, can you address how the different platforms aid in streamlining the research and development process?
So, whatever. I'll make
go ahead,
one
Dr.
point, and
Hildreth.
I'll let you have it, Dr. Mcmurray Heath. The two vaccines that have reached this stage are exciting for one reason. They represent a new technology called messenger RNA. There's a central dogma in biology that genes encode proteins, but there's an intermediate called messenger RNA. The messenger RNA then becomes a working template to produce the protein. So most vaccines involve either viral proteins or inactivated or pieces of the virus. In this case, we're giving the person messenger RNA that encodes the protein. The messenger RNA gets taken up by cells in our bodies. Our cells then make the viral proteins, and then the immune system responds to it. What's so exciting about this is this technology will probably be adaptable to a whole range of viruses and other kinds of things to which vaccines need to be made. This also accounts for some of the speed that we're seeing, because mRNAs can be developed in a very short period of time compared to recombinant proteins and inactivated viruses and recombinant viruses. So I'm excited because we have a totally new platform for vaccines that might accelerate the process in the future as well. And to me, that's very exciting.
Okay.
I would just agree. It's a very exciting time. And, one of the things to think about is that it's important to get the proteins from the COVID virus into the human body so that it can start eliciting an immune response. Now, there's many different ways to do that. In our traditional flu vaccine, where you think about, we need to grow it in these huge facilities that take a very long time to generate the proteins. That in that type of vaccine, you're actually delivering the fully assembled protein from flu into the human body, usually with adjuvant, to try to irritate the immune response and elicit a strong response. What we're seeing now with COVID is not just protein-based vaccines, but also vector-based vaccines that are using, for example, a cold virus, adenovirus, to deliver a gene from the COVID virus into the human body to then start replicating and produce enough protein to elicit immune response. And we also have these mRNA-based vaccines, which are really just skipping a step and delivering the messenger RNA directly into the human body. So one of the great hopes of the mRNA vaccines is that perhaps we'll need less adjuvant to elicit a strong immune response. And this is incredibly important, particularly for immunocompromised patients such as the elderly, where it's sometimes difficult to get a strong immune response in response to a vaccine. Now, you also mentioned monoclonal antibodies. Now, those are more being used in the therapeutic setting rather than the vaccine setting. So those will be available for patients after you've become infected with COVID and you're trying to mount your own immune response. Those could aid you in producing that immune response by offering you exogenous antibodies to help fend off the virus.
Thank you. Dr. Tuckson, how do you determine the safety and efficacy of a COVID-19 vaccine?
Well, what's of course happening now as we go through the process of these clinical trials is that we are, watching very carefully. People are already reporting the major side effects at this point have to do with just the site of injection and the traditional things that you would expect in terms of sore arms and so forth. One of the things that is important as physicians think about counseling their patients about concern for this is just as you notice that when you have the immune system kick in and becomes effective, that does produce certain sensations in the body. And so we need to make sure that as we're counseling our patients, that we're letting them know that an immune system that is beginning to function intensely may cause some different symptoms and effects and so forth, but that those are not things to be concerned about. But overall, I think that the real answer to this question will really lie as we continue to go through the process of the clinical trials. One of the things that I think a lot of people fail to understand in the public, and physicians will have to counsel their patients, is that we still, by and large, have not seen the data fully, and that the trials are continuing. While we have great evidence and great reason, as all of our colleagues have said, to be excited, we still, though, need to know that there is a long way to go. Lastly, I would comment that on the safety profile, one of the most important roles that our audience will have will be in the surveillance after the vaccines are administered. And that surveillance process will be ongoing for quite a while so that we will know about these side effects. And I think that our community of physicians will need to be very well prepared to participate in that post-marketing surveillance activity, which is really where we'll get most of our answers.
Okay. Well, I see that there's lots of questions coming in the box. Here's one. I've heard that the MCR5 is included in not only a COVID-19 vaccine, but in other vaccines. Can you talk about the ingredients and the safety of the vaccines? And there's a corollary to that that says the MRC5 is reported to be developed from lung tissue of aborted male tissues. So I think that's one for Dr. Corbett and Dr. Hildreth. And if the other panelists want to chime in, please do.
Dr. Hildreth, I'll let you take it.
I think they're referring to the type of cells that are cultured to produce components of, I may be mistaken, but oftentimes when we do these kinds of things, we have to produce certain components in cell lines that are immortalized, that are grown in culture. And I believe that MRC5 is one of those cells, and that's not uncommon. It doesn't represent any particular threat of causing harm or danger. It's just part of the process of producing some of the components that need to be incorporated into the vaccine. We've used that cell line many times in my own laboratory when we do some studies, certain studies with HIV. If I'm getting it correct, that's what they're referring to.
Thank you. Yes. Dr. Wallace, why is diversity in the vaccine clinical trials important?
This is a interesting question that gets asked a lot, and I'm sure my other panelists fellow panelists will have other thoughts as well. But certainly I think it's important because we want to ensure that our communities are involved in the studies and involved in helping to determine whether or not any vaccine that may be approved also works for our communities. And I think it's also important that we look at diversity because, as we know, as you talked about, Dr. Brown, specific communities are bearing the burden of COVID-19 cases in this country and in international settings as well. And so thinking about how increasing or ensuring that those communities also have access to participating in the trials to really help to address the burden that communities are experiencing. And, for this conversation, I will say specifically, we're talking about Black communities. So Black communities are bearing the burden of COVID-19, in part because of other health conditions that are underlying as a result of systemic racism and other issues. So I think it's really important that we consider how engagement in clinical trials would benefit all communities.
Dr. Brown, can I jump in on that
Yes,
as well?
please.
So one of the important things to consider is that we're seeing 3 times the rate of mortality in the African American community once you already have COVID. So putting aside the issue of exposure or pre-existing susceptibility, once you have COVID, Black patients are dying at 3 times the rate, Hispanic patients are dying at 2 times the rate of their white counterparts. So sitting here today, we do not know why that is. It may be underlying genetic differences that track with race. It may be concomitant comorbidities that track with race, there could be many different reasons. But the only way we will know for sure if the vaccine protects equally in Black and brown populations is to have those populations well represented in the trials. And that's part of the reason why Bio has been working hand in hand with our companies to make sure that they have good representations in the trial. And we're seeing, 35% representation of Black and Hispanic patients in the Moderna trial, for example, 42% of Black and brown patients in the Pfizer trial. So this is critically important. We're also seeing amazing co-tracking. Like, for example, 1 in 3 patients who's died from COVID has type 2 diabetes. So we want to make sure that all of the comorbidities that are really found in minority communities are well represented in the trial so that we know that the vaccine will work in that setting. And I see there's a question about children in the trials as well. And to date, most of the vaccine trials have not included children. I think Pfizer is the one minor example, down to 16 or 18. But you will see in the next few months, as the phase 3 data starts coming in, that they'll be including more and more children in the trials, but expect indications for children for the vaccines to lag by 3 to 6 months from the approvals that we expect to be coming in soon.
Dr. Brown, I really think that it's important that we double emphasize the point that Dr. Mcmurray just mentioned, because a lot of our patients do not understand that we are very involved in these clinical trials. And the statistics that she gave are really critical. And so let's remember that 37% of that population in the Moderna trial were people of color, 6,000 Hispanic, 3,000 African Americans, but also given the patient profiles of our patients, it is important to know that 42% of the people in the study for Moderna, at least, had high-risk conditions such as diabetes, obesity, or heart disease. This is of particular relevance to so many of the audience members here. And I think this gives some confidence that when the final data is ultimately reported, that we will be able to be convincing in our conversation about what we know, given not only ethnicity, but the range of clinical conditions that are most relevant to our population.
Thank you.
Brown, can I add one more point?
Absolutely.
There's a basic fundamental biological reason why we need to include minorities in the trials. The vaccines are designed to elicit an immune response. And to illustrate the point, allergies are a manifestation of our immune systems. If you think about it, there are some fundamental differences in how we respond to pollens and antigens. Just to make the point, African Americans are much more prone to have allergies to peanuts, for example, much less so for whites. Conversely, whites are much more likely to be allergic to animal dander than blacks are. And so even though the immune system functions more or less the same across races, there are enough differences to demand that in order to know that the vaccine works in us, and again, vaccines are eliciting immune responses, we have to be tested in the trials to know for sure that they work. So from my perspective, there's a basic biological reason on top of everything else why we have to be involved, and that's it.
Okay. In reference, and when we were talking about genetics, there was a study out of the Houston area where they tested some 5,000 COVID-19 patients, and they found a mutation in a gene called the D614G. It's a spike protein, and well, we know what spike proteins do. There was a question as to whether that increased the susceptibility of getting COVID-19, and it was at a more aggressive phase. And so can any of the panelists speak to that?
Yeah, sure. I can speak to that. So the what we call is the G mutation. It's in the spike protein. So the spike protein is the protein that's on the surface of a virus, and it's the way that the virus gets inside of a cell. So it's like the key that unlocks the door to the cell to allow the virus to get in and replicate. So sometimes mutations pop up on this spike protein because that's just the way that the virus works. It's working as it's transmitting with people, it's working to mutate. However, one should not be alarmed by one amino acid change that is largely hidden in the inside of the spike protein. There are reports that it made the virus more infectious, but every single vaccine that is currently in the US portfolio for phase 3s has shown that the vaccine can protect against that particular virus in some way or another, whether it be in vitro, which means in a laboratory, or in people. And so I think that we do keep an eye on mutations that pop up with this virus, but intrinsically, coronaviruses mutate less than, for example, influenza viruses or HIV viruses. And so the mutation rate is very small compared to what we've seen previously with other types of viruses. So there isn't really cause for alarm just yet. I think that a really good vaccine will be good against natural occurring mutations for a little bit.
Okay.
You know, the flip side of that are the host genetic factors that we're still trying to understand as well. And there's probably people on this panel who can address this more in depth than I can. But I do know that there are some early indications that people who go on to develop severe cases of COVID appear not to be mounting the same level of antibody response in immediate response to the virus as those who recover, which can seem self-evident. But it begs the question: what underlying either genetic or predisposing status of those patients is inhibiting their initial robust immune response?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that was actually from my perspective, one of the more promising pieces of the phase 1 data that came out, is that, comparing vaccine responses in people to that of responses to people who got naturally infected. While there were about 1/3 of people who didn't mount a really robust immune or antibody response to natural infection, 100% of participants in phase 1 trials did. So the vaccine is, at least from what we can tell from phase 1s, eliciting very robust antibody responses that supersede that of natural infection, which is actually, one of the arguments against vaccines is that, why can't I just get infected and mount immunity? Well, if you wait for natural immunity, it's a little bit more questionable and also not as safe as a vaccine. And so vaccines are really tend to be a more effective and safe way to get immunity than natural infection.
Okay, thank you. The question next comes up about what about the side effects of the vaccine? But let me ask a question. There were 2 of the trials that put a hold on their studies because of a side effect or something that happened. And I have not seen the data safety and monitoring data from them, but it has come in that it's okay to move along with these studies. So again, can you speak to the side effects of a vaccine and then address it in context with the 2 studies that had to go on a pause?
So can I make a point that needs to be remembered?
Yes.
Whenever you enroll tens of thousands of people in a study, you can just use actuarial data to predict that some of them are going to get sick with something that's not related to the vaccine. So when the Data Safety Monitoring Board puts a study on hold, an effort is then made to determine, is this related to the vaccine, or is this going to happen anyway, whether or not the person that received the vaccine? Because again, keep in mind, with 15,000 people, one of those individuals is likely to get sick from something unrelated to the vaccine. And so oftentimes when the Data Safety Monitoring Board stops a study, the evaluation that's happening, Dr. Brown, is to determine, was this actually related to the vaccine? Was this going to happen irrespective of the person receiving the vaccine? And there are lots of ways to do that, but that point needs to be kept in mind, that the scale of these trials means that there are going to be some occurrences that happen that are unrelated to the vaccine. And oftentimes that's what the stoppage is for, is to make that determination.
Okay. Does anyone else want to weigh in on this?
I'll just say that. Go ahead.
I just want to offer. I'm sorry.
I just want to say that from my perspective, actually, I think that is confirmation that the system works, and that if there is something that happens, whether it be from the vaccine or not, that there is a halt on the trial until someone figures out what the problem was. And so to me, that's gratification that the system works.
Yes. Dr. Wallace?
I was going to say almost the exact same thing. And just to confirm, offer for folks who may not be aware, who are listening and watching, that there are quite a few different patient or participant protection measures in place, and quite a few checkpoints to ensure that the welfare and safety of participants is being considered and centered in the process. And this starts all the way from the institutional review boards of these studies throughout the Data Safety Monitoring Board, who's sort of the external folks who review all this data from an unblinded fashion, as well as the FDA.
And can I just add that we're seeing an unprecedented amount of transparency and communication. So not just is the system working, but it's also being communicated, those results, which I think is incredibly important. And both of those trials have resumed now, meaning they satisfy their Data Safety Monitoring Board, which is an independent group of researchers that are monitoring these trials, as well as the US FDA.
Yes. Thank you for making sure that people know the data safety and monitoring boards are independent of the studies. So again, transparency, very important. There's several other questions, but one in reference to, we're hearing reports that the vaccine is reported to be 90% effective, 95% effective. What does that really mean to our patients?
So
who wants to take that?
Can I make a point that I don't want to get lost here?
Yes, please.
The vaccines that are being evaluated require that you vaccinate the persons and they go about their daily lives and you monitor them to see whether or not someone's coming down with COVID-19. The point is that the vaccines aren't necessarily preventing infection. They're limiting the disease that you get once you get infected. I mean, in some cases, the symptoms are very mild, but in other cases, the symptoms can be severe. And what's really remarkable about the Pfizer study, now that the data is fully available, in the whole study, there were 170 individuals, I believe that's the correct number, who got COVID-19. I think 11 of whom got severe disease. All 11 of those who got severe disease were in the placebo group. None of the ones in the vaccine group had severe disease, which means that
I just want to say, Dr. Hildreth, you are mixing up your two studies, okay, but that's okay.
All right.
The point is going to be,
okay. So I got
it's flipped, but it's okay. The point is made regardless.
But the point is that what we hoped for, what I really hoped for, was a demonstration that the vaccines, if they didn't prevent infection, would actually prevent severe disease, which means preventing death. And they actually are doing that. So what you do is you look at how many infections occur in the placebo group. You compare that to how many infections occur in the vaccine candidate group. And that's how you can determine the percent effectiveness. So I think the numbers are 100. Well, I better let you do that because I got the studies reversed.
So for the Pfizer trial, they enrolled like 40,000 people. There's 20,000 people that got placebo, 20,000 people that got vaccine. Those people, after being enrolled and getting their vaccine or placebo, they go about their daily lives. And then if they present symptoms, they call the trial physician and they get diagnosed as a COVID-19 case or not. So total in both of those groups, there were 170 cases. 162 of those were in the placebo. There were 11 severe cases and 10 of those were in the placebo. So the efficacy rate that you see is a 95% efficacy against prevention of COVID-19 disease. So what that means is that the vaccine decreases one's risk of getting COVID-19 disease by 95%. So,
and as a former FDA official and been close contact with FDA about this, FDA was hoping for 50 or 60% efficacy, which is around the range we see for flu vaccine, and yet it's still worth all of us getting our flu vaccine each and every year. So to see 95% efficacy is just mind-blowing. It's amazing.
Yes.
There are three ways that we think about vaccines in the HIV Vaccine Trials Network and the COVID-19 Prevention Network. So in this conversation, we're talking about the prevention of disease. And I think that that's a really important distinction to make, because I think many people, when they think about a vaccine, they think about the prevention of infection. And of course, one of the other ways is to prevent the progression of disease. So I just wanted to bring that up because I think it's important to make the distinction about those three ways, because it isn't always clear when we talk about vaccines, what are we really talking about?
Yes.
Can I make another point that's really important? Which is, since the vaccine does not prevent infection, another question is, will it, like in the case of HIV, if we treat HIV-infected persons to make the virus undetectable, we know they can no longer transmit the virus to others. We'll have to ask the same question with COVID-19 now, because the vaccine is preventing disease, but is not preventing infection. So does that mean that a person who's vaccinated who gets infected could still therefore transmit the virus to others?
Wait, Dr. Hildreth, I don't think that you can say that. So you can't say the vaccine is not preventing infection because they haven't actually shown the data yet. So that's a prospective analysis,
but
right?
If you get disease, right, whether disease is mild or severe, that means you must have been infected.
Wait, but they didn't test for infection in everyone. So you would have to test for infection in everyone in order to make that determination.
But
so you
and even the rate of disease in the active arm of the trial was very low, right?
It's going to have to be determined, though.
Yeah, it's going to have to be determined. Yeah. So, but you can't say that it's not preventing infection yet. And there are trials that are coming up from other vaccines. Like I believe Johnson & Johnson is going to run a trial that actually determines whether or not they are preventing infection. And there are prospective analyses that you can do once you have all of your samples together and determine whether you're preventing infection. But you can't say it's not preventing infection yet. All you can say is that what's proven is that it's not it's preventing disease at 94.5%.
You know, another important thing to keep in mind here is that there have been over 750 research and development programs that are still underway to combat COVID. 191 COVID vaccines are under development as of today. We hear a lot about the 10 that are in the latest stage of clinical trials, but it's important to know we have many different approaches that are going down this road, and these are just the earliest leaders, but we have lots of different shots on goal for this, which is important to keep in mind.
Yes. Okay, another question. Can you catch COVID-19 multiple times?
Yes.
Okay, no discussion on that one, huh? Yes. Okay. Okay.
But proven, but is it likely? I think is the question as well.
I think now that they are mostly case reports, but you can, and that was the question.
And I think the question is, how long does the immunity last from having the disease? Does it matter?
The documented cases range from about a month to several months later.
Okay.
There are at least 7 cases.
Does it matter the severity of your disease? If you have
two of the cases that I'm aware of, the first time these individuals got the virus, their situation was mild. They only had mild disease. The second time, 2 of them required ICU and ventilation. What that tells me is that getting infected is not sufficient to give you protection, which is a point that Dr. Corbett made earlier.
Yes.
There are some people who actually want to get infected so they'll be immune. That's a very poor decision to make, right? So that really needs to be emphasized.
Dr. Brown, I don't want to lose, I don't think you should lose your question. And I think Dr. Corbett is in a great position to confirm this. You asked, do we know how long immunity will last from the vaccine? Yeah. And I do believe that the answer is we don't know yet. The data is still needing to be confirming that. But Dr. Corbett, what is your sense of that?
Right. So we do not know. So there's immune responses and then there's immunity. So immune responses are all of the things that happen to your immune system that we can test. And then immunity is, in my opinion, whether or not you are prevented against disease or infection. So the phase 1 clinical trial started in about March. And so we're about 7 months into that data, and I can't speak on it, but I'm not crying tears. So you can assume that we are happy with the type of immune responses and how long they're lasting, at least through month 7 or 8 or something like that. And so we'll start to get more and more data about how long these immune responses are lasting. I think in the beginning, a lot of questions came about in that regard because the difference between immune responses and immunity were somewhat smushed together by the media. And so what we're seeing with natural infections is that, at least for the people that actually generate really good immune responses, they are having long-lasting immune responses, but we don't know what that means in regards to immunity. The difference is that some people just don't generate really good immune responses following natural infection, and that's where the real difference occurs.
Yes.
Another corollary of the conversation is that it's too early to know if for COVID we're going to be facing something like we face with flu, which is, there's genetic drift of mutation of the virus over time, as Dr. Corbett talked about earlier. And so will we have, or there may be waning immunity, will we have annual vaccinations for COVID? It's too early yet to say, but it's something people should keep in the back of their mind. But we've done this before. We do it for flu every year.
Yes. And there's a question about that. Let's see, the question is, how you you take the flu vaccine and they say you get sick with the flu first. Is it the same with taking the COVID vaccine, that you're going to feel like you have COVID? And do we know that based upon the trials?
So
I think it's important for people to be prepared that we are seeing mild adverse events. Dr. Tuckson was saying very early on that, you might feel a little poor when you get this vaccine to begin with. That's not uncommon for many of the different common vaccines that we use all the time. But we do need to prepare a patient population that you may encounter some mild adverse events, but it is worth it for some assurance that you will not face severe COVID disease. At least you have a 95% chance of not facing it from this early data.
Yes, and that is indicating that that's an immune response, and that it's important to know that your system is trying to work appropriately. Have there been enough Black community participants in the trials for us to be able to feel confident on the efficacy of the vaccine in the Black community? Who would like to take that question?
Dr. Mcmurray, he really addressed that earlier.
Yes.
Yeah. So we got very high levels. We have not yet seen the subpopulation analysis to fully know the breakdown by subgroup. We hope to see that coming soon, but I know they hit the target numbers that FDA really laid out for them. And they slowed down the trials and redirected their enrollment efforts to be able to achieve those targets, and worked with a lot of partners to get there.
Okay. So far, yes, go right ahead. Dr. Hildreth.
I was just going to say that I'm on the committee that reviews the data for the FDA, and our meeting is set for mid-December, and we'll be presented that data about the breakdown of subgroups and how they responded.
Thank you. Are we looking at an annual vaccine for COVID to assure protection, just as every year you're getting the flu vaccine?
Dr. Corbett.
Only time can tell. Again, I think that question was largely addressed before, but one of the key things about the flu that I think that we fail to really recognize is that the flu is so genetically diverse, right? There are different strains, subtypes, and what happens after flu season is that the influenza, the flu, just circulates around the world and it recombines with each other. So different parts of one flu virus can come to another flu virus and make a whole nother flu virus. So by the time it gets back to the US in a year, there are completely different strains that you're being exposed to every single year. That type of what's called genetic drift is not happening with coronaviruses, not just this coronavirus, but any coronavirus. It just doesn't happen that way. And so that's one really key thing about influenza vaccinations and why we have to get them what's called seasonally. So I think that as long as we are eliciting immunity that doesn't wane which means doesn't fall below a set point where where you can be protected, I think we will be good and clear for not having to be vaccinated every year for coronavirus.
Okay.
I think one of the other things to really highlight is that Dr. Mcmurray Heath mentioned that the pipeline for COVID-19 vaccines is expansive. And so I would imagine that as we continue to learn more and our understanding of this continues to grow, that the optimization of giving these injections would also get better and increase as well.
Yes, I mean, if everyone remembers Gardasil, the HPV vaccine, it started out as 3 shots, and now I think they're down to like single shots. And I know a personal perspective from the laboratory that I work in that helped invent the vaccine that, we're already thinking about 2nd and 3rd generation vaccines. And so, and testing those kinds of things that people are concerned about, like 1 dose and all of those things. And so as time progresses, of course, optimization of the vaccines, not just the actual vaccine, but how we deliver the vaccine will get better.
And that's also very important, that there's a range of different vaccines out there in terms of their administration. So some need to be stored at, -70, some need to be frozen, some can be kept at room temperature, some need 1 dose, some need 2. So there are many different options that are likely to come out, and they may be applicable for different groups or settings. The other thing to keep in mind is that we've seen several different coronaviruses over the last decade, MERS, SARS, and now COVID. So it is more than likely that we will face future coronaviruses that we have to fight, and the technology that we're developing now could be very helpful in a rapid response to those as well.
Yes. And you spoke about the various types of vaccines that are there. And I want to go back to address the ones that seem to be ready from the EUAs, needs to be refrigerated at a low temperature. What do you think that will be as an impact in the minority communities, particularly the Black communities? Can Dr. Tuckson take that question?
There is a real issue. First of all, I think that we need to understand that just as our science colleagues have lauded appropriately the extraordinary scientific breakthrough by mRNA technologies and how they're being used in this case, which is just breathtaking from a scientific point of view, that same level almost of innovation will be required in the dissemination process. Imagine trying to disseminate vaccines to 340 million people. The scale of this alone is daunting. But as you mentioned in your question, Dr. Brown, that we know from the Pfizer product that the level of refrigeration is going to be a serious issue, and the technology involved in loading these doses into vials, and then from vials into specially formulated packaging that then have to be shipped around the country and stored in places will pose challenges. The good news on the Moderna side is that the level of refrigeration is significantly less and significantly less onerous. But what we as African-American health professionals really need to be paying attention to is that we're not seeing very clearly the plans at the federal level for full dissemination. This is one of the challenges that the Biden-Harris administration is facing as they are not able to look underneath the hood on exactly what the dissemination process fully will be, and how many of the sites will be in community-based centers, how many of those will be in physician offices that are relevant to the people on this call. So there's a lot more to understand. But at the end of the day, the logistics and supply chain challenges here will test the mettle of American innovation and ingenuity. We will have to be doubly vigilant in making sure that the decisions about allocation of the vaccine, especially as doses are going to be limited, we have to make sure that the allocation decisions are being played out the way they have been recommended by the prestigious National Academy of Medicine Committee on the allocation of this vaccine. I was privileged to sit as a member of that committee, and we fought very hard to ensure that African Americans and other people of color will have very ready access early in the process, right after the frontline and heroic and sheroic healthcare professionals get vaccinated. And so we will have to make sure in our local communities, in every community around this country, that we are being vigilant in being advocates to ensure that we are getting in line for it. And then secondly, we're going to have to watch very carefully about the dissemination pathway to make sure that they don't bypass our clinics, our facilities, and cause people to have to travel outside of their communities in inconvenient ways, raising yet another hurdle to our being able to close these disparities in health status.
Thank you. And
Can I?
Yes, go right ahead.
I'm sorry, just wanted to add to that. I really appreciate that comment, Dr. Tuckson. I think it's really important that we also provide providers and communities tools to really sift through the myth versus the facts about what is actually happening, not just in the clinical trials, but as you said, to be vigilant in the process and to really understand and seek information that is factual based. And there's, as you all know, that there is myths and misinformation about this entire process. And the politicization of the clinical trials regarding this has greatly impacted communities' perception about the end products. And so I think the vigilant point, I think I just wanted to underscore.
Yes. So can we put to rest the politicization of vaccine development and the warp speed and all of those things? We'll have all of my panelists just make a statement in reference to that so that it reassures our listening audience that this is above board and we have not been pressured.
I'd like to go before Dr. Corbett. I'd like to go before Dr. Corbett because I want because she can't say what I need to be able to say. Because of her humility. When we talk to the African American community, every single program, every forum, every radio show will always bring up Tuskegee, 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 and so forth and so on. And we need to be very clear. And of course, the pernicious and horrific behavior of the President of the United States, who has made this such a distrustful process. Let's remember one thing, that now this time is not 1930, that the head of the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute at NIH is an African-American man. Dr. Corbett is the leader of the vaccine basic science effort at Tony Fauci's institute. We didn't have a Dr. Corbett prior, in 1930. We have her now. We have Dr. Hildreth. I don't want people to misunderstand how important his role is. He is sitting on the committee right there with Peter Marks, who at the FDA is the person responsible for signing off on whether a vaccine is safe or efficacious. Dr. Hildreth is inside of the process. And then lastly, one of my colleagues earlier, I think Dr. Michelle Mcmurray Heath, mentioned the IRBs in every one of these clinical trials around the country. And people of color are on all of those IRBs as well. So I wanted Dr. Corbett to just be able to say that your very presence is the anti-politicization for the Black community. We need to put your face on every poster talking about this disease so people will not bring up Tuskegee yet again in 2020 and we don't keep living a 1930 disaster.
Yeah.
Amen. Amen.
Yeah, I think that one of the other things that's really missing, especially from the role that I have. So I started working in Anthony Fauci's institute under Dr. Barney Graham, who is a community advocate far beyond what I've ever seen for any white man ever. And I started working at the NIH in 2014 under the previous administration. I remember actually starting my job and going to Africa about the week later in the middle of the Ebola epidemic. So the previous administration actually set a plan forth around what is called pandemic preparedness. And the NIAID took up a large stake in really preparing vaccine efforts for the families of viruses that had pandemic potential. There are 24 families that have viruses that have pandemic potential, and the coronaviruses sit in one of those families. And so I'm the scientific lead for the coronavirus team. And so there is a portfolio of really basic research that started before this current administration that backs the science of these vaccine efforts in such a way. And I think that that's one of the things that is really missing. It's a key missing piece. And so what happened in the beginning of this pandemic is that we knew we had the knowledge, and we knew that we had the collaboration with Moderna, and we knew that we had the tools, and there's this network of clinical trial sites, as Dr. Hildreth was saying, to really move really quickly. But a lot of the backing for putting that stuff into play came before the current administration. And so I want people to make sure that, you know, they understand that that due diligence was done outside of what is considered to be the politicization of this entire effort. I think that it's very hard to wrap your mind around it, but you know, everybody was doing the work before.
And can I just put an exclamation point on that, which is just this week, our companies are facing a revenge backlash from President Trump because we failed to meet his COVID timeline. He is irate that our companies are releasing data after the election and devising policy revenge to put in place in the waning days of his administration to act out his anger. So if anyone thought that our companies were puppets on strings being manipulated by the Trump administration, just ask President Trump if he feels that way today.
And Dr. Brown, I would just want to make one more quick point, two quick, really fast points. Number one is, I think people need to be very attentive to Dr. Peter Marks at the FDA. This is a man who is a consummate public servant, who stared down the White House when the president demanded that FDA fast track the approval process in time for the election. He's the one that stood up and made it very clear. Under no circumstances would he ever allow that to occur. And they created the data, the data monitoring elements that pushed back the data requirements for the length of time that people had to be in these trials well beyond the election date. And that's important. Number two, though, for the African-American health professionals on the line, we need to be very well aware that there will be mischief. The social media that we use is being deliberately targeted by white supremacists, by Russian bots, and others who mean us no good deed. And so our community and your patients will come into your offices, and they will have lots of information that they think is true, that is designed to stir up political sentiments and other kinds of things to make them distrustful of you, distrustful of science, distrustful of the process. And you need to be well armed and well prepared for understanding that and being able to be very skilled in how you have conversations with your patient through the sanctity of the patient-physician or the patient-health professional relationship, where you have to listen to these things and then debunk these myths if we're going to be able to have the healing environment that is so necessary for each and every one of us.
Thank you. Additional comments?
I'll just say that, you know, we have prioritized communities at risk in the National Academy of Medicine distribution schedule that Dr. Tuckson talked about, in the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices that's operated by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. But in the early days, demand will be greater than the supply of vaccine. And if we do not line up early when called upon, we may miss our opportunity. So it is very, very important for us to mobilize our communities and make sure that we take and seize that opportunity when it presents itself.
Thank you. The next question really relates to, I think, what Dr. Hildreth will be dealing with in his meeting in the middle of December. What do we know about the people who contracted COVID-19 in the vaccine trials? What's their race? What their comorbid conditions? I'm sure all of that will come out in your meeting, so that information probably is not known now, but will happen there. Is there likely to be a high dose recommendation for seniors in the response from when you come about getting the mass vaccine? So is it going to be different for people over a certain age? No, I don't think that's there.
So while there's unlikely to be a dosage recommendation, there might be certain types of vaccines that prove more effective for seniors. That data is not in yet. Just keep an eye peeled for it, because you will want to have the best option for your patient.
Okay. What is the likelihood that the COVID-19 virus to become seasonal? And we asked this question about an annual vaccine, especially in the face of the mutations and all of that. I think we've done that one.
I saw a question that I'd like to address, actually. I saw several that I'd like to address, but one that I really want to address is around the technology, at least for these first couple of vaccines that people are hearing about, what's mRNA technology. There's this running idea that this is the first time mRNA technology has ever been in people. Moderna, for example, has existed for several years as a company. They have phase 1 trials, phase 2 trials with mRNA vaccine candidates for flu vaccines, for Zika vaccines. And so people think a lot about the safety of these types of platforms because they haven't been necessarily approved for general use for a vaccine. And I want people to understand that tens of thousands of people have had these types of platforms injected into them even prior to this pandemic. There's a large amount of safety data around the platforms that have driven it to this point where we are now. And also the reason why vaccines never have had to utilize this kind of technology before is twofold. One is that we've never really had to monopolize on a very new technology that had the ability to be mobilized quickly into a rapid development process so that we could save lives in this way. And the technology just hasn't been called upon from a development standpoint. So once it gets to a point past the trials to develop it for anything, there has to be a need. There has to be a need for it at the end of the tunnel. And there really hasn't been a chance, an opportunity for this kind of platform to be developed yet. But it's been in people before, and we have a fairly good understanding about reactivity and all of these things in people even prior to this pandemic.
Okay, thank you. Susceptible pets going to need the vaccine down the road?
Listen, I'm from North Carolina, and my uncle, I guess he Googles around coronaviruses, and he found out about the one that infects pigs, and he's like, "Oh, are you about to make a vaccine for the swine?" I'm like, "Oh God, no."
Yeah.
My husband's a veterinarian. He says no.
But I think though that this does raise an issue that I think that both Dr. Corbett and Dr. Mcmurray Heath do need to elaborate on. A lot of the patients of the people online now are going to come in with all kinds of theories as to where did COVID come from, and trying to prepare our community for the reality of zoonotic infection. And that, as you have indicated, both of you in your previous comments, that this is not the last time we're going to see a virus like this. This is not the last rodeo here. That the more we are intertwined with animal species, that this is going to occur. So could you just sort of just give our audience a sense of how do they mention and talk to their patients that this is not a virus that was developed by the CIA or, heaven forbid, some mad scientist in China?
Yeah, the reason Dr. Corbett should really address this,
but go ahead.
The reason we're seeing more and more of these has a lot to do with global warming and eroding of the barrier that we normally see between wildlife and humans. And so, Dr. Corbett, you should take it from here. This is your area of specialty. Oh. You go, girl. I know you have it.
I had to let out a sigh because I went to graduate school at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where viral evolutionary biology is a really big thing. And so this is fairly well understood, and I had to wrap my head around why people don't grasp it. But I think one of the explanations that I think helps the general population grasp this concept is that these coronaviruses are largely found in bats. And bats are mammals, and actually they have cells that are very, very, very similar to humans to a large extent, just with like certain very small tweaks. So as these viruses are in nature, in bat caves, et cetera, they keep getting better. And Dr. Fauci explains it as that lock and key, where over time, you know, the key to the lock doesn't fit, but the virus goes back into nature and it evolves and it gets better. It comes back, it knocks on a human cell. It doesn't fit. It goes back into nature. And so there's kind of this cycle that happens. And eventually what happens is that protein I talked about before just starts to fit into a human cell, because that's how evolution works. And sure, you can totally make a virus in a laboratory. But I saw the sequence on January 10th when it first came out. No man with that virus is sloppy. Nature made it. Okay. No man, just certain things in it. It doesn't look like a man-made virus, even by accident, at all. And I think that you just have to understand, and also that it's really history repeating itself, right? No one questioned whether or not SARS over a decade ago jumped from an animal to a human. No one really questioned whether MERS did. So really showing people these graphs that we have online that show how the reason why MERS was in the Middle East is because of very close contact with camels. And people were basically like kissing their camels and getting in contact with MERS. And so this is the same kind of thing. This is this animal to human transmission. It happens with flu. It happens with coronaviruses. And, you know, it's bound to happen with other viruses as well. And so I think it's one of those things that we have to recognize, that even though we think animals are very different on a cellular level, we're not that different from a lot of animals. And so they carry viruses that can fit themselves to infect us.
Yes.
But the other element that needs to be remembered, there's a statistical element involved here, because if the virus adapts itself to infect humans and an animal, if that animal never comes into contact with humans, it won't jump into humans. So there's an evolution that happens, but there also has to be encounters between humans and those animals. Otherwise, it won't jump into humans. And the other thing is the adaptation of viruses that transfer from humans to humans. That's when pandemics happen. Viruses jump from animals into humans all the time. The difference is that in this case, it adapts to go from humans to other humans. That's the difference.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
Yeah. And to Dr. Hildreth's point, that opportunity for that connection between animals and humans is what we're seeing with global warming.
Yes.
And, you know, the erosion of the wildlife habitats that let wildlife stay in the wildlife instead of start intruding into the cities and intruding into communities.
Yes. And of course, coming from the military, I am still accused that the laboratory at Fort Detrick, where I worked, started the HIV/AIDS virus. And so again, we're going to be faced with these myths down the line, and we have to keep dispelling them over and over. And people say, I know that B4 lab up there, that's what you did. And so again, we will hear this, but let's make sure that our providers understand that no, it didn't come from something that the human created. Let's see, how likely is it that the COVID vaccine becomes mandatory? Are we going to invade on somebody's rights?
I have heard this question what feels like 100 million times since February. there's no plan that I'm aware of to make any vaccine mandatory. That people have the ability to decline the vaccine if they choose. I would ask that if you do choose to decline it, that you do so from an informed place, and that we also need to remain vigilant. As Dr. Tuckson said, I'm going to start using that word more frequently, regarding the use of protective measures, irrespective of whether or not we're uptaking the vaccine or not. And the other question that was asked that I definitely want to mention about whether I would take the vaccine, and the answer to that is I would.
Can I just add to that, though? I think the economic drivers to encourage participation in having the vaccine might be large. You know, once we have vaccines that are proven safe and effective, you can imagine a workplace that says, you know, we want all of our workers to be vaccinated. If you're in the restaurant industry, can you imagine being able to advertise, you know, all of our wait staff have been vaccinated against COVID? Schools may require it. So, you know, it will not be mandatory, but there may be quite a few levers pulled to make sure that people get vaccinated. But that will only happen once it's in wide accepted use.
Yeah. I think the other thing we have to be very good about, and again, our audience is skilled at knowing how to have empathetic and scientifically based conversations with our patients. But I think that what we have to also help our patients understand is that what happens if you don't take a vaccine? Are you prepared to wear your mask for the next 5-10 years? Are you prepared to have our community's economics destroyed? Are you prepared to be quarantined? Are you prepared not to visit your elderly grandparent? Are you prepared not to have Thanksgiving? Are you prepared not to have Christmas the way you used to have it? So I think sometimes in our zeal to be concerned about being victimized by some nefarious group of people, we almost find many people in our community rooting against the vaccine. And I think we have to help them to understand not only all the points that have been made so far in the show about the reasons that you can have confidence in it, but also what's the alternative? What's the end game? And I think this is going to be important for us to help our patients to understand.
I have 2 more questions, and then we're going to have to wrap up. What is the anticipated out-of-pocket costs for the vaccines for individuals or family? Do we know? Is there a projection in that area?
We do know it's zero, that this vaccine will be free to any and all. What is the issue for our providers on the call is that you will be compensated for your administrative fees. There are now 2 codes that have been developed by the AMA CPT code panel that describe it. And it's important that these 2 codes exist because many of these vaccines will require 2 doses. And so the reimbursement, as I now understand it, and again, early days here, that for those 2-dose vaccines, you probably will get paid a little less for the first one than the second one. And that, of course, is to incentivize making sure that somebody comes back for the second. But the codes are now created, and the insurance companies are prepared to reimburse in the normal ways based on those codes for that. But for the patient and for your patient, the costs will be zero.
And just to add to that great point, Dr. Tuckson, it's also going to be incredibly important that our healthcare providers use the tracking systems so that we're able to know who has had first or second dose of the vaccines. We're going to need to track that like we do for childhood immunizations. And while the cost is zero in the US, we are still trying to make sure that the cost is very close to zero around the world, because we will not be safe until the world has immunity against COVID. And so that work is still ongoing. And we're hoping that the Biden-Harris administration will kind of restore international cooperation on that front.
We need to rejoin the WHO is what you're saying.
Absolutely.
That and the ACT Accelerator, there's several efforts underway to deliver vaccines to underserved countries, to developing countries around the world. And we have not been participating.
Yes. What strategies can be used to overpopulate the clinical trials to assure diversity, extending the time for enrollment in the phase 2 and 3 trials? What methods would you suggest to make sure we have equitable representation? Who wants to take that?
I'll just say we threw the kitchen sink at it. We used, we did absolutely everything. I mean, the companies worked with nonprofit associations. We helped people form connections with the National Urban League, National Association of Black Churches. You name it, everyone has been pitching in and trying to make sure that we have good representation in these trials.
And the NMA, the National Black Nurses Association, all the 4 Black medical schools, all of them are throwing everything they have at it. I also think that it's important to give credit to Moderna for slowing their trial down nationally until they could recruit enough people of color to put in. And I give them credit for that. And they were successful. But the key to it, over and over again, the key to having more African Americans and people of color in clinical trials are the people on the call right now. It is our health professionals talking to our community. If you're not in it fully, if you're not totally committed to it, we get nowhere. We need you to be the ones that are telling and counseling our patients to make the decisions that we hope that they will make about participation.
Yes, just again, there's another question that popped up, but I think it's really have been answered. Will Black and brown people be given priority to receiving the vaccine due to the higher incidence of the infection?
The allocation decisions that we made at the National Academy of Medicine were number 1, health workers. Number 2, right below them at 1B, were people with 2 or more chronic illnesses. And after that, with teachers and people on the frontline workers in other industries. And then right below that were people with 1 chronic illness. So guess who they were talking about? That's the way we did it. But let's remember this, Black health professionals. You're going to have to be the ones that identify who are the people with 2 or more chronic illnesses and bringing those people forward to be first in line. Again, the vital importance of the Black health professional in the next stages of this drama.
Okay, and finally, just going around, if each of the panelists can take a quick 20 seconds to answer, what potential implementation or distribution challenges do you foresee for this vaccine?
For me, it's hesitancy, honestly. I think that there are about, what was it, like 57% of people who said that they wouldn't get the vaccine in the US, all inclusive, all races. And I think that that's probably going to be our biggest challenge is convincing people that they can trust the process and that they can trust the product that came out of the process.
Okay. Next panelist, Dr. Hildreth.
I agree. And that's why we at Mcmurray are devoting an enormous effort and resources to that very issue, making sure that there is adequate information provided so that people can make an informed decision to accept the vaccine. It has to be their decision, but they need information to do that. So that's what we're focused on. So I agree with Dr. Corbett.
I agree with my fellow panelists. One of the strategies that we've employed and we utilize in the COVID-19 network and the HIV vaccine trials network is transparency in the clinical trials and ensuring that communities have access to all the information in the trials to make informed decisions about their participation and that they're involved meaningfully in the process so that uptake and acceptability looks higher in communities following the trials. So I think, the hesitancy piece is going to be really important, and the messaging around the trials and the dissemination process is going to be, the messaging around the product to Black communities is going to be really important.
Okay, Dr. Tuckson.
I just was fortunate enough to have an editorial published in Science magazine, Science Journal, and my thesis was trust and trustworthiness of the entire health enterprise, from the basic science laboratories all the way through to the patient-physician and patient-health professional relationship. And that includes every component and every player. If we do not solve this trust problem, we have zero chance of being successful.
Absolutely.
Dr. Mcmurray Heath.
Well, just in an effort not to be unanimous, I'll also say, I'm also concerned about the transition. We have to make sure there's a smooth transition to the Biden-Harris administration so that there's no hiccups in carrying out the great plans that have been drafted to date.
Thank you all. I think this has been fantastic. The whole aim of this panelist and the presentations was to arm our providers with knowledge, because knowledge is power. And if you have the knowledge, you can do better. And so again, I want to turn this back over to Dr. Morgan so he can give us the closing remarks. Thank you all, panelists. And I suppose we can give an applaud with the little hands on the chat box. I don't know how to do that. But thank you all very much. Dr. Morgan.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Morgan. There
yes.
You're on.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Dr. Brown, and thanks to each of the panelists. This has been a spectacular panel, and everything that we hoped would be discussed for the providers has been. And so now the ball is in the court of those of us who are providers and who care for our patients, our families, and our communities. We'd also like to thank the technical expertise of BlackDoctor.org and CoVPN, and to all of the sponsoring organizations. There will be extensive reference information for all who attended this evening on the websites of the sponsoring organizations, and the recording will also be available. That will be quite a reference, I think, for the ages. I'd like to thank you again for being on board. Be safe, keep your distance, wash your hands, and wear your mask. Good night.